面就诸多的各位专家都是这个英语为母语的这个报告人，所以为了跟大家这个保持一致吧，所以这个报告今天我们就用英语来讲。然后大家如果在提问题的阶段呢，可以随意哈，我们可以用中文讨论或者用英语讨论都可以。Okay, so the topic of my talk today is effects of proficiency, L1 background and topic on the syntactic complexity of EFL learners' spoken production. I would like to first of all acknowledge that this is joint work with my doctoral advisee, Minjin Kim, who is working with me in my department. And here is a quick outline. I will start by giving you a brief summary of the two primary goals of the study, and then I'll provide some background information, including what syntactic complexity is, what kinds of research has been done before, especially L2 writing research, and then what kinds of research gaps exist and why we're pursuing this particular study. And then I'll talk about the method of the study. It includes data that we use, the way that we analyze the data for complexity, and then also the ways that we use to evaluate the effects of the three variables, proficiency, L1 background, and topic on L2 speaking syntactic complexity. I will then present the results, and then at the end, I will discuss the implications of the results and offer some ideas for future research. Okay, so we have two primary goals for this study. One is to evaluate the reliability of L2 syntactic complexity analyzer on L2 English learners spoken production. So this is a methodological goal. And the second one is a research goal, which is to look for and to identify the effects of proficiency, L1 background, and topic on L2 speaking syntactic complexity. In the background section, I will first of all talk about the conceptualization, operationalization, and automated tools for syntactic complexity, right? And you're probably all familiar with this idea of complexity. In particular, syntactic complexity is a subconstruct of linguistic complexity, and it is often defined as the extent to which the structures used in language production, either spoken or written production, are varied, elaborate, and sophisticated. So varied meaning by using diverse kinds of structures, not repeating a small number of structures. Elaborate will be if we, for example, looking at a noun phrase, how much modification are we doing with the noun phrases, right? And then sophisticated will be something related to relative difficulty, for example, how frequent the structure that we use in terms of the frequency of those structures in a large reference corpus, for example. Okay, and this construct is also understood as multidimensional, encompassing global complexity. So something like mean length of a sentence, for example, looking at the overall complexity of a sentence, subordination, which can be the finite or non-finite, the use of dependent clauses, for example, and then coordination, which can be either at the clausal level or a sentential level or at the phrasal level. So we can talk about coordinate phrases or coordinate sentences, and then also phrasal complexity. In particular, we like to look at how complex the noun phrases that have been used in language production are, right? And of course, with these different kinds of dimensions, we need to have different kinds of measures to gauge the complexity at each of these levels. And people have been posing two kinds of indices in general. One is holistic. These are things like mean length of a sentence or number of dependent clauses per clause, right? We're not really talking about the fine-grained subtypes of structures. For example, we are not differentiating different kinds of dependent clauses. We're just talking about dependent clause or finite subordination as a whole. And we also have fine-grained indices, which differ from holistic ones in terms of their attention to very specific structural subtypes. So if you're looking at dependent clauses, you differentiate different kinds of dependent clauses. And similarly, if you're talking about different kinds of noun phrases or modifiers of noun phrases, you look at different kinds of modifiers. We'll see some examples of these kinds of indices in a little bit. And then with the development in our conceptualization and operationalization of this construct, there have also been a number of tools that have been developed, including, for example, the tool that I developed quite a while ago, L2SCA, which has 14 holistic indices that we'll take a look at in a little bit. And then there is also another tool for the automated analysis of syntactic sophistication and the complexity, which integrates a very large number of fine-grained indices. For example, a number of very specific kinds of dependence, such as prepositional phrase modifiers, right? For different kinds of noun phrases, such as a noun phrase that is the object of a preposition. So we're talking about both very specific types of dependence and then also very specific types of phrases. Here is a quick summary of the 14 measures in L2SCA. And if you have ever used this tool before or have read a paper on syntactic complexity, you probably have seen this table before. We have a few different types of indices, right? But they're all holistic in the sense that we're not talking about very specific kinds of structures. So we have 3 measures that look at length of production unit, including mean length of clause, sentence, and T-unit. We have a sentence complexity measure, which is number of clauses per sentence. We have several subordination measures, including clauses per T-unit, complex T-units per T-unit, dependent clauses per clause, and dependent clauses per T-unit. We have 2 coordination measures, right? 2 look at coordinate phrases, and 1 looking at coordinate sentences, T-units per sentence. And then finally, we also have 3 phrasal structure measures, 2 are looking at complex nominals, and 1 looking at verb phrases. Okay. So there has been quite a bit of research on the effects of learner variables on L2 writing syntactic complexity, as well as effects of task variables. But we'll take a look at learner variables first. And we know that there are many different kinds of learner variables that could have an effect on variation in L2 use, such as L2 proficiency, right? Learners who are at a higher level of L2 proficiency will use language differently from learners who are at a lower level of proficiency. Linguistic cultural background, this will be your first language background, for example, cultural background as well. And then there are also different kinds of sociolinguistic characteristics, such as gender, and then also learning experience variables, depending on, for example, when you start learning a language, and then also whether you use a language at home or not, whether you're studying the language in foreign language or second language context, and those kinds of things. So all these variables could have effects on variation in L2 use. And you will probably see studies that look at the effects of these variables in different kinds of settings, such as instructional settings or experimental settings, right? However, in learner corpus research, because we have to rely on learner corpora and the kinds of variables these learner corpora encode, we are kind of limited by what is available in existing learner corpora. Because of that reason, most learner corpora studies have centered on the effects of L2 proficiency and L1 background, and really not so much right now on these other variables yet. So we are going to look at, oh, I think I'm missing something. Right. Okay, so let's look at proficiency effects first, right? And obviously we have to talk about the concept of proficiency first, and we have different ways of measuring or defining proficiency. Some studies use what we call learner-centered methods, right, of proficiency. For example, you could have people take a proficiency, a standardized proficiency test, such as the TOEFL or English, or test for English majors, band 4, band 8, those kinds of things. In this case, we're not really testing their writing ability per se, right? But even though the test may include a writing proficiency test, rather we are looking at the overall language proficiency of the learners. And once we say a learner is at a particular level of proficiency, we're not really talking about the quality of the writing sample. Okay, we're talking about the general language proficiency of the learner as determined using some kind of a proficiency test or measurement. Another method will be text-centered, which will be, we are not really concerned about how a learner may or may not be proficient overall in the language, but rather we are looking at the quality of the text, right? We often have some kind of rating rubric that we use to assign either a score or some kind of proficiency level. to the text, regardless of who produced it, right? So in this particular case, a learner may actually produce different text of different quality, and the different text may be assigned to different kinds of proficiency levels. Okay, so these two different kinds of ways of measuring proficiency, we have to be clear which way we are using, and therefore when we are comparing results from different studies, we know what we are talking about. And there has also been increasing effort to align proficiency levels with the common proficiency scale, such as the Common European Framework of reference for languages, right? And the advantages of doing this is so that we can actually compare studies from different studies more usefully. Even though different studies may have used different kinds of specific measurements of proficiency. Okay, so once we know how we can define proficiency, we can also look at studies that have examined the effects of proficiency on L2 writing syntactic complexity. So many measures actually have been found to discriminate or correlate with proficiency levels, and I will quickly talk about the results from two studies. One is from my own earlier study in 2011, published in TESOL Quarterly. So you will see here we have 14 measures, right? We have 14 rows. Each row represents results pertaining to a particular measure. We have a number of columns. You see 1 and 2, 2 and 3, 3 and 4. So this actually corresponds to program level in Chinese universities. So you can think of this as first or second or third or fourth year English major students. And we're trying to compare the students from different kinds of grade levels to see whether a particular measure will discriminate students from different grades, right? So we're not going to go into the details. What we can see is, for example, some measures actually differentiate quite a number of pairs of grades. For example, the third row from the bottom, C and C, discriminates grade 1 from 2 and 2 and 3, 1 and 3, 2 and 4, and 1 and 4, but not so much from between 3 and 4. And actually, we don't really see any difference, right, between grades 3 and 4, which may or may not be good news. Basically, once you reach the end of your junior year in college as an English major, hopefully your grammatical development has more or less completed, right? So you have mastered the range of different kinds of structures, you're able to use them. It becomes a matter of using them effectively and appropriately for different kinds of purposes. It's no longer a matter of do you know or not know a particular measure or feature, or are you able to use that? But this table shows that different kinds of measures may be able to discriminate on different proficiency levels. And these are all holistic measures from L2 SCA. In another study, Kyle and Crossley, 2018, looked at the ability of a set of fine-grained measures to predict rated quality ratings of TOEFL essays. So you can see, first of all, these measures are fine-grained because we're talking about very specific kinds of structures, such as adjectival modifiers for object of the preposition, right? Adjectival modifiers is a very specific kind of structure or modifier, and then also object of the preposition is also very specific kind of a noun phrase. And they found that these 7 guys, so the first 6 actually are all noun phrase features. Number 7 is a clausal feature, but they're all fine-grained, and these features together correlate with holistic ratings of TOEFL essays at 0.45. So they're pretty explanatory, right? I think take into account of the fact that quality writing really involves a lot of different kinds of linguistic dimensions. So looking at only syntactic complexity and being able to explain this much is actually a big deal. But the commonality of the two studies is such that we know both holistic and fine-grained indices of syntactic complexity may discriminate or correlate with different kinds of writing proficiency. The next variable is first language background. Okay, so we know already from a lot of different kinds of second language acquisition research that L2 learners' L1 background can affect different aspects of their L2 use in various ways, right? So some really typical examples include the use of collocations. For example, speakers of Chinese may sometimes tend to use certain kinds of collocations in Chinese when they're producing English collocations, right? of course, over time, we can overcome these kinds of negative transfer. And sometimes L1 transfer can be positive, right? Especially when there were these shared features between your L1 and your target L2. And then we can transfer that knowledge usefully in producing the L2. However, when the features are not congruent, meaning the L1 feature really does not apply in the L2, and you end up transferring something negatively. So we know that's a general phenomenon. However, with respect to the specific effect of L1 background on syntactic complexity, we don't actually have a lot of empirical research. There was one early study by Crossley and McNamara in 2012, and they in terms of one particular feature, which is number of words before the main verb, right? This is called the left embeddedness feature. The more used more words before the main verb than L1 Finnish learners, who in turn used more than L1 Czech learners. And we're trying to explain why this may be the case, right? Obviously, it's not a proficiency matter. It's not because they could not produce more words before the main verb. Rather, there seems to be some kind of correspondence to how this particular feature plays out in different first languages. And then in a study in 2015, I did with Haiyang Ai, we looked at differences in the SC of English writing among college level English writers with 8 first language backgrounds. And we took data from the International Corpus of Learned English. And here is a quick summary. Basically, we're not going to get into the details of the results. But what the table is showing is how learners from each first language background, such as Japanese and Chinese, right? How learners from each L1 background differ from native speakers of English. So L1 American English writers in terms of the 14 different measures. So if you see a minus sign, it means that this particular group of learners were using significantly fewer of these type of structures, right, than L1 English speakers. So if we look at Chinese learners in the second row, we can see that Chinese learners of English produced significantly shorter sentences. So MLS is mean length of sentence, also shorter T units, and they used significantly less subordination, right? All 4 subordination measures. This is all minus, as we can see. So, and there were a few other things as well. The interesting thing that you are seeing here, although, is that you can see every group differs from the L1 English group in different ways. No two groups are the same, even when the groups were categorized as at the same proficiency level. And interestingly, it is not the case that all learners were underusing something, right? If you look at French, Bulgarian, and the German learners, they were actually doing something more than the L1 English speakers. So Germans were producing significantly longer sentences and clauses and units than L1 English speakers. So it's no longer really a proficiency matter. It becomes a matter of the effect of the first language background. And we know that actually L1 German sentences written in German are also the longest among all the languages that we have looked at in corpus linguistic analysis. So this may explain why German speakers of English tend to also produce longer English sentences, for example. But the main idea of this table is such that we clearly see some kind of L1 effect, right? It is the difference we see here cannot all be explained by proficiency alone. But keep in mind that we're looking at our 2 writing study results, okay, so far. And then next, right, there has also been research on the effects of task-related variables on L2 writing syntactic complexity. And this, of course, is a big deal in task-based language teaching research. And we know there are various kinds of task-related variables, such as the genre of the writing, right? The prompt type, task type. So in TOEFL, we have integrated and independent writing, so different kinds of our task types. We also have different kinds of prompts, right? We have done some research on that too. So you may be writing on the same kind of task, but you could provide the learner with different kinds of information. So for example, you may say, just write an essay, or you may say something like, write an essay with the theme sentences given to you. So you may actually provide a theme sentence for each paragraph and ask the writer to kind of complete the paragraph using the theme sentences given to them. And you could also provide some keywords, for example, and say, make sure you use those words, right? They may give you an idea of what kinds of information needs to be there. So there can be different kinds of prompt types as well. And then, of course, there is this idea of writing topic, right? Even when you're writing an argumentative essay, depending on the topic you're writing about, you could be using different kinds of language, obviously. So these are all, and there were some other variables too, but these are some common researched variables, task variables, genre, prompt, or task type, and then also topic. And a lot of studies in this area have tried to validate one of these two models from an information processing perspective. One is the limited attentional capacity model, which argues that there is greater competition between complexity and accuracy as cognitive demand increases, which means if you're working on a task that's more demanding cognitively, because you don't have enough attentional resource, you're going to have to pay attention to content and the fluency, and you're going to actually struggle with the complexity and accuracy. The cognition hypothesis actually argues against that, right? In this hypothesis, it is posited that increased accuracy and the syntactic complexity will both increase, actually, as task complexity along resource directing dimensions increases. And that's because as we are writing on a more complex task, we actually do have to allocate more resources to fulfill the demands of the task. And by doing that, we actually pay more attention to both the accuracy and the complexity of the language used. So you can see that these two models kind of compete with each other, and a lot of studies have tried to use data to offer findings that either support or not support one or both of them, right? So, right, I'm sorry, I kind of messed up the order of of the PowerPoint slide. So because of the focus of the current study, we are only going to briefly talk about previous research on the effects of writing topic. Okay, we are going to skip previous studies on variables such as genre and task and prompt type. Okay, so in an earlier study that I did with two collaborators, we looked at the differences in the syntactic complexity of a set of essays written by graduate students in the US on two different topics. One is what we call this personal appearance topic. The other is called the planning for the future topic, right? The first topic is like, young people are paying too much attention to personal experience these days. And the other is if you plan for the future when you are young, you are going to do a lot better when you are older. Okay, so we found that even though these essays were written by the same group of learners, right, they were actually very important differences in terms of the complexity of the grammatical structures. So the appearance topic elicited more elaboration at the finite clause level. So we are seeing longer clauses, more coordinate phrases, and more complex noun phrases, which means we see more modification of noun phrases. We see coordination at the phrasal level. And we also see longer clauses, probably because of the greater use of both coordinate phrases and complex noun phrases. The planning for the future topic actually did something different, right? So here we are seeing longer sentences and then also more subordination. So think of greater use of dependent clauses, things like although, because, right? While, whereas, things like that. And then also non-finite elements such as to do something, right? Or doing something. And it's very interesting. We were trying to figure out why we are seeing these kinds of differences, right? It doesn't even matter at this point whether we see differences in the quality ratings of two essays written by the same student, right? Because presumably because they wrote these two essays without too much of an interval between them, we suppose that the writing proficiency level stays stable. So we thought that maybe the differences we saw between these two topics was because the second one entails causal reasoning. You have to explain why you think planning for the future when you are young will give you a better future when you are old, right? And this causal reasoning requires juxtaposition of the relationship between multiple entities or events. So you have to say, although something and something. So there you're kind of talking about the relation between two propositions, for example, right? Whereas in the personal appearance topic, you kind of have to provide more detailed information about whatever you are describing. Okay, so there were two other studies that were quite interesting to us, and we talk about them because we will actually be comparing our results against these results. So I will just briefly mention them. Young 2017 actually used the same data set, right? No, not really. They were looking at part-time job and the smoking topic, not the same data set that we used in the current study. So these two topics become the same as the topics that we are talking about, and therefore it becomes interesting to compare our results with theirs, but not the same topics as in Young et al. 2015. So they were comparing essays written by the same group of learners, EFL learners, on two topics. One is college students should take some part-time jobs and it is good for them. And the other is smoking should be banned in restaurants, right? So both argumentative, but kind of different, obviously, in some ways. And he found that the part-time job topic elicited higher levels of complexity than the smoking topic. And his explanation was that the part-time job topic was more relevant to college students and also more familiar to them than smoking. But you could argue otherwise because, some college kids also smoke. But on average, right, part-time job is more relevant to the majority of our college students. And he argues that because of this higher level of relevance and familiarity, you kind of have more attentional resources to allocate to writing, and therefore your complexity will increase. Okay. Now, very interestingly, Atka and Sarikoglu, they worked on the same kind of a problem. They were trying to figure out whether this was the case or not. And so they looked at three topics. One is death penalty, and the other two were online learning and the cell phones, right? And if you look at these three topics, it's quite clear that online learning and the cell phones will be more familiar and maybe more relevant to college students than death penalty, right? However, they found that quite to the contrary, the death penalty topic elicited more complex structures than online learning and the cell phones. Okay, so the opposite, basically, from what Young found. So they were trying to explain this in this way, and they argued that really the death penalty topic was more impersonal and therefore more cognitively demanding. Now you think of the cognition hypothesis, right? Now, because this topic actually is more impersonal and therefore more demanding, you have to allocate more resources, and therefore your complexity actually will become higher. Okay, so you'll see some differences in the results, right? As we also investigate the effects of topic in this study, we will come back to these results and talk about the implications of our findings as well. Okay, so I hope I will give you a general idea of existing research in L2 writing with respect to the effects of learner and task-related variables on L2 writing syntactic complexity. There really hasn't been a lot of research on L2 speaking complexity overall, right? And we found two particular groups of studies. First group compared the syntactic complexity of L2 speaking and L2 writing using either developmental learner data or cross-sectional learner data. So here we are basically comparing speaking against writing, right? You can think of people looking at, for example, is speaking more complex than writing or vice versa, or maybe what kinds of features are more characteristic of L2 speaking and what other features may be more characteristic of L2 writing, right? And then also you can talk about how these how different kinds of complexity features may develop over time, And do some things develop earlier in speaking and then later in writing, or vice versa, or do they develop at the same time in both speaking and writing? Okay. And we actually have some very different results again among the studies, but we can hypothesize that some of these differences may have arisen from differences in the first language background of the learner populations examined in different studies, and then also the age of the learners that were being examined, as well as differences in sample size. The first study by Chen et al. 2015, for example, only looked at 2 identical twins, therefore a very small sample size, and they followed 2 identical twins for some time, and then they were recording their speech. So they have both spoken and written production data from the 2 identical twins, and they used a couple of indices from my tool, and they found that the mean length of T unit, dependent clauses per T unit, and coordinate phrases per T unit were both higher in spoken production. And they did not really see any kind of a significant growth over the short period of time they were following the learners, so they couldn't shed light on differences in development. But they found that these 3 particular features that looked at were higher in spoken production than in written production, which is kind of interesting, because if you look at the results from Huang et al. 2020, you see some differences, right? In particular, you will see that CPT, so coordinate phrases per T unit, is also higher in spoken in their study, but they found that dependent clauses, so finite subordination in particular, is actually higher in written production. Right. So right there, we see some similarities, but also differences. And then Biber et al. 2016 compared learner production in response to TOEFL speaking and writing tasks, right? And basically the same students would have performed on both the spoken and written tasks. And they used a large set of fine-grained indices to examine those samples, and they reported that speech is less linguistically complex than writing. More specifically, they found that adverbs and finite adverbial clauses were more frequent in spoken production, but noun phrase modification is more frequent in written production, right? And if you compare their results with those from the other 2 above there, you will see that actually, just in terms of dependent clauses, we see some differences, right? Chang et al. And Biber et al. Both show that finite subordination is more frequent in speaking than in writing, but Huang et al. Seems to suggest that somehow it is more frequent in written production. But again, we don't have a lot of studies looking at this, and there is quite a bit of difference in terms of the first language background and age and sample size among the 3 studies. Right? But that makes it interesting for us to also look at the issue and then compare our results against theirs. And then a second group of studies that looked at in L2 speaking complexity looked at which particular measures could distinguish proficiency levels or predict quality ratings or show longitudinal growth in L2 spoken production. Right? We have 3 studies here. An earlier one by Iwashita et al. Found that these 2 measures, VPT and MLU stands for mean length of utterance, they were both higher in essays rated at higher proficiency levels. In other words, you know, if an essay is rated higher, it probably, well, actually this is spoken, I'm sorry, not essays, in speaking samples. So if your speech is rated higher, then you will be using more verb phrases, right? Which includes both finite and non-finite verb phrases. And then also the average utterance of each, the average length of each utterance will also be longer. Chen and Zechner, who was actually doing this for automated speech scoring, they found that 17 specific measures, including 4 from L2 SCA, mean length of sentence and T unit and dependent clause per clause, and also complex T unit ratio, explain 24% of variance in human ratings of L2 English speech. This, in a way, is kind of similar to what Kyle and Crossley found, right? In terms of the predictive power of our fine-grained indices for L2 writing quality. So similarly, Chen and Zechner show that these measures can also predict the quality of L2 speaking. And then Mustafa et al. 2021 found that coordinate phrases per analysis of a speech unit increased significantly over a 15-week period. Okay, so the use of coordinate phrases basically increases over time, and there was development going on. But really, we don't have a lot of studies that even tackle the same kinds of problems yet. And we see some studies looking at L2 speaking complexity, but really we don't have a systematic understanding of the following two issues, right, which become the focus of the current study. So the first research gap that we identified in our review of literature is what features of L2 English speech samples may affect the accuracy of the L2 syntactic complexity analyzer. Well, actually, of course, the motivation is more general, right? We don't really have a good summary or description of what kinds of features of L2 English speech samples may affect the accuracy of automated tools for syntactic complexity analysis in general. And we, of course, are looking at this particular tool in the current study, right? It doesn't mean that this should be the only tool that we look at, by no means. Then also, how reliable is the tool for analyzing L2 English speech samples after those issues are systematically resolved? In other words, there has been calls, especially by Chen and Zechner. So they actually talked about the prevalence of errors and also conversational features in L2 speaking samples that they argue pose very serious challenges to automated analysis, right? And these other studies, really, a lot of them used a manual analysis. If you look at the Chang et al. Study and the Huang et al. Study, they were doing some kind of manual analysis. Bible et al. Rely on the Bible tagger, but the output would then go through some kind of a manual correction and also systematic post-processing. This is expected because of the errors and the conversational features that may affect the accuracy of automated tools. So we would like to look at to what extent will these kinds of features become issues for the performance of L2SCA on speaking samples, right? And then also can we find ways to address those issues, and when we do, how reliable can the tool become? Okay, now the second one, so the first one is methodological. The second question is more empirical. We are trying to understand the effects of proficiency, L1 background, and topic on the syntactic complexity of L2 English speaking. We really don't have a lot of studies on this topic already, even though there has been a lot of research on L2 writing, right, on this topic. So the data that we used in the study came from the spoken monologue subcorpus of the International Corpus Network of Asian Learners of English. Many of you may be familiar with this corpus, right? This has both a spoken component and a written component, first of all. And we're using the spoken component. And as you can imagine, in speaking, we have both dialogues and monologues, right? Dialogues will be interactions or conversations between two or more people, either a group discussion or a pair conversation. And that data is useful, but also presents a challenge because you're going to have to somehow separate the learner's speech from the interlocutor's speech, which may be another L2 learner, but also maybe an instructor or maybe a first language, maybe an L1 speaker. So there is this added thing. Plus, as we know, if you are talking to someone, then your production may be affected by what you are hearing. So there is that effect as well. Monologues, of course, they are spoken, obviously. The advantage of looking at monologue is that you don't have to worry about this interaction, right? You don't have to separate the utterances produced by your target learners from those that are produced by other people, right? That you don't want to look at. And also you kind of don't have to worry about this effect of the interlocutor speech on your target learner's production. Okay, so that's why we decided to look at the spoken monologue subcorpus. And the nice thing about the IC and ALE is that they very carefully controlled topic effect such that every learner will contribute samples on two topics only, right? One is the the smoking topic, and the other is the part-time job topic that Yun 2017 looked at. So they were using the same topics for both speaking and the writing, right? And we are looking at speaking here. So altogether, this component, this subcorpus includes 4,400 speech samples produced by 1,100 participants, and they came from all kinds of first language backgrounds. And each participant produced two 60-second speech samples, where one with a 20-second preparation time, and the second one with a 10 seconds of preparation time. So think of every participant producing 4 samples altogether. Okay, so 2 samples on the part-time job topic and 2 samples on the smoking topic, right? So the 2 samples for the part-time job topic will be the first one, you've got 20 seconds to prepare, and the second one, you've got 10 seconds to prepare. The same thing for the smoking topic. And the participants took a VST, so the vocabulary size test, which is an estimation of your vocabulary size or breadth knowledge. And this can be used as a proxy of your general language proficiency, right? And they also reported their TOEIC or TOEFL scores. If they have both, they do both. And then what they actually do is they have this matching mechanism that they use to match TOEIC scores to the CEFR levels. And more specifically, all the participants were matched onto A2, B1. There were 2 sub B1 levels or B2 plus levels on the CEFR. And then the way they did this was that they would first of all convert VST scores to TOEIC scores. There was again some kind of a way of matching that, right? Depending on your score on the VST, you will be mapped onto a particular TOEIC level, and then from the TOEIC level, you'll be mapped onto the CEFR level. So pretty much all the students would have a number of so several pieces of information about their proficiency: the VST score, TOEIC score, or TOEFL score, and the CEFR level. However, not every student has all of that. So in order to make our data useful for our comparison so that we can evaluate the effects of these 3 variables, proficiency, L1 background, topic, we sampled 928 samples produced by 232 L1 Chinese or Japanese or Korean EFL learners whose TOEIC scores and the CEFR levels were both available. So it's really just a subset of the spoken monologue subcorpus of the IC and ALE. And we wanted to have a large enough size of each subgroup, right? Chinese, Japanese, and Korean learners of English. And then also wanted to make sure that we would have at least 2 ways of assessing proficiency. So topic is okay because everybody just talked on 2 topics. Excuse me. So once we have the samples, then we would have to obviously perform syntactic complexity analysis of the samples. And we decided to focus on 6 holistic indices from my tool. And these indices will capture different dimensions of the construct. So we focused on these measures for a number of reasons. This is by no way to say that we should not look at fine-grained indices at all. Rather, because we really don't have a lot of research looking at the reliability of automated tools on L2 speaking, syntactic complexity assessment yet, we wanted to start with a good basis, right? So obviously there was going to be a need for manual analysis, and it is going to be less labor intensive to look at these holistic indices than to look at very fine-grained indices. That's reason number 1. And number 2, we know from previous research that fine-grained indices tend to have lower accuracy by the automated tools, right? So the more fine-grained the structures become, the harder it is for tools to get them completely right. Whereas if you are looking at a higher level structure, such as if you just have to count the number of clauses, it is going to be easier than to count the number of specific kinds of modifiers, right? Because there is quite a bit of room for error that will not affect the counts. So that's the second reason. The third reason is that, as Kyle showed in his analysis, many fine-grained structural subtypes may be very rare, so not rate, may be rare in L2 production. And you can imagine that if you're looking at second language learners production of speaking, they are not going to be using, so it is very likely that they will not be using quite a lot of different kinds of very fine-grained structures, such as they may not be using subjective mood, right? They may be not using certain types of modification very frequently. So if you get into those fine-grained structures and they're not used frequently enough in your data set, then it becomes not very meaningful for the analysis. Whereas if you look at the holistic measures, you will not have this problem because you're looking at subordination as a whole. Of course, you're going to see subordination in some way. So these are the reasons, but also, of course, we have to know the importance of looking at both fine-grained and holistic measures. And I always argue for a good balance between the two. And I do not be, some researchers argue that you should only look at fine-grained indices, which I disagree. For the reasons we talk about here, right? So a lot of times, some fine-grained measures may not even exist in production, which makes it useless to look at. But more importantly, I believe that these two kinds of indices really usefully complement each other, right? Just like when you look at rating an essay, we do want an overall score, which is highly holistic. You get 90 out of 100. But then we also would like to have some analytical rating, right? So, okay, then how well did I do in terms of content, in terms of development, in terms of language use, in terms of other things? So we would like to have both a holistic assessment, but then also more fine-grained assessment. I don't see a conflict between these guys. And the specific 6 measures that we chose were reported in previous research to distinguish spoken and written production, which means they can do something interesting here, or they have been reported to predict L2 proficiency or L2 oral proficiency. So we did look at the measures used in the few studies we reviewed just now, and we look at what they were using, and we looked at those guys so that we could, on the one hand, try to capture different dimensions of the construct, and on the other hand, we could compare our results against their results. And actually, a few studies did use L2 SCA in some ways to analyze L2 speaking data, such as the Chan et al. 2015 paper. However, they only looked at very few indices, and they did not really systematically evaluate the reliability of the tool on the data. So we think it is important to do so because without that information, we are not really sure how reliable the results will be. Okay, so the way that we did this evaluation, again, this is really preliminary work, and there is a lot more work to be done. So we randomly chose 10 samples from our data set. And then for each of them, we first of all performed an analysis of L2 speaking features that may present problems for L2 SCA. So specifically, we first of all performed parsing of the samples using the Stanford parser. The Stanford parser, if you're not familiar with it, will simply do 2 things, right? One is to segment the sample into individual sentences. And because all these speeches have been transcribed, right, into text files, there were actually punctuation marks in the samples. And the parser will rely on sentence final punctuation to determine sentence boundaries in the samples. Once it has segmented the sample into individual sentences, it will try to provide an analysis of the syntactic structures of every single sentence, right? So that you will know where is the subject, where is the predicate, where is the dependent clause, where is a noun phrase, and so on and so forth. So once we have these kinds of analysis done, we end up with a set of parse trees for each sample. So each parse tree will simply represent the structure of an individual sentence, right? We then query the parse trees using the Trajax patterns in L2 SCA to identify issues that may lead to structural unit misidentification. So what this means is that, for example, in order to count how many dependent clauses there are in a particular sample, L2 SCA actually uses a particular Trajax pattern to match the path trees or the structures of the path trees, right? If this sounds very abstract to you, that's kind of okay. Just think of this, okay, I've got a pattern, I'm using the pattern to kind of determine how many times have something that the pattern matches occurs in your sample, right? If the pattern is found 5 times, then I know there are 5 dependent clauses in the sample. Now, when we do this manually, what we can do is that we can look at what the pattern returns for us. And we can, as a linguist, we can determine whether the patterns are matched correctly or incorrectly, right? And if we see some kind of incorrect matching, then we can look at it and say, okay, so it looks like the problem is here, right? So if it is a good match, then that's good. We look at all the misidentifications and then try to determine what the problems are. And once we have a good handle of the problems, we can then try to develop. Then there will be 2 kinds of things. One is like, I can't really do anything about it. It's just gonna be there, right? The other is, okay, we actually can do something about it. Maybe by removing some things, right? By normalizing some things, or maybe updating some, changing some things even. And that way we are not really affecting the analysis of the syntactic complexity itself, but we are trying to remove certain problems to improve the accuracy of the tool. So the goal of this part of the analysis is to develop a pre-processing script that can analyze and process and clean a sample to address those issues that we have identified in this stage. And then we also performed another type of analysis, which is the analysis of transcription conventions, because the speeches were manually transcribed into the text files by probably some research assistants hired, right, by the team. We wanted to see whether there would be how much inconsistency there might be in the conventions. As punctuating speech with sentence final punctuation marks is in a way pretty subjective, right? Because unlike in writing, where the writer will always, or supposedly the writer should, right, put sentence and final punctuation marks, and we could rely on those. In speaking, we don't. So I may have a pause here, but even when I have a pause, it doesn't mean it is going to be the end of an utterance or sentence, right? I could continue, I could come back to it. So there is that. What we did was we actually removed all the sentence final punctuation marks from the samples in the first step. And then in the second step, we will just listen to the audio files and then re-punctuate the samples, right? And we followed a procedure for doing this. There was some criteria that we used, which I will explain briefly in a little bit. And then once we have done the re-punctuation, we would compare the original and the re-punctuated files. And we were hoping to determine whether there would be a lot of problems or whether the problems will be minimum. If we don't have a lot of problems, then maybe that's fine, right? And if we do, then we have to assess the effect of transcription conventions on the analysis, right? And then, I can tell you now that this step did not result in any change to the pre-processing script because we only found 2 cases of disagreement. So we decided to let it go. But otherwise, we would have done something to revise it, maybe to develop a different kind of punctuating algorithm, and then add that to the pre-processing step. But after pre-processing, we would then manually code all relevant structural units, which will be something like coordinate phrases or dependent clauses or complex nominals and these kinds of things, right? We will manually identify the total number of these kinds of units in each sample, and then we will calculate the 6 indices, right? Mean length of clause, for example, complex nominals per clause. We will calculate the indices and then compare these human computed indices to the tool computed ones and look at how strongly they correlate with each other, right? So we are hoping to see a high correlation, obviously. So once we have done that, and we were very happy with the reliability, which I will report in a little bit, we then pre-processed all the other files and then analyzed the pre-processed files using L2SCA. Okay, so for the statistical analysis, we use a linear mixed effect analysis. using the LME4 R package to account for the random variance associated with a subject or participant. This is a very commonly used analytical method now, especially when we want to also accommodate or to account for individual variation. So specifically, we have 6 indices we are looking at, right? And we built 2 models for each of them, both with the index itself as the dependent variable. So mean length of a clause, for example, will be the dependent variable. And then proficiency, L1 background, and topic as fixed effects. But for proficiency, we have 2 ways of operationalizing it. One as CFR levels, so A2, B1, B2. Or we could use the TOEIC scores, right, which will be a continuous variable, whereas CFR will not be continuous. And then we also use the participant as a random effect. We report both marginal and conditional R-square. Marginal R-square will be the effects of will be fixed effects, and conditional will be fixed and random effects combined. We also perform some multiple comparisons, which I don't think I will actually include in the presentation, so let's just skip that. Okay, so now let's look at the results, right? So first of all, the results pertaining to the reliability assessment of L2SCA, right? So we found really the biggest problem lies in frequent repetitions of or restarts with subject-verb structures. And these kinds of things really inflate clause and dependent clause counts. For example, you will very commonly see things like, so if they want to do something, they must earn money by themselves. You've got if they want. And if you have the parser deal with this, it is going to count if they want and if they want twice, which we really don't want to do, because this is really just, it's not really meaningful in terms of assessing the grammatical complexity of the production or understanding the grammatical proficiency of the learner, right? We really just want to say, well, you were trying to say, so if they want to do something, they must earn money by themselves. That's what we want to assess. So this was a big problem, but also it's not a hard problem to deal with, right? And sometimes the learner may be only repeating so if, not always if they want, but we just systematically would deal with these kinds of repetitions and the false starts. Interestingly, we didn't really find a lot of issues with the counts of T units, complex nominals, or verb phrases or coordinate phrases. They were largely accurate, but also keep in mind that we are dealing with the counts, right? And we found that in particular, we have a lot of things in the samples that are like, okay, the more the better, of course, right? So these kinds of short utterances, they are punctuated as sentences. And if you think about these units of conversation analysis, right, or the units of analysis of speech, normally people think of those as an utterance, right, or an analysis unit for conversation, because they are pragmatically important, right? It is kind of like you're agreeing on something, you're emphasizing something, or whatever you're doing. These things are important. So and these things were actually not always counted as a T unit in traditional analysis of writing complexity, because a T unit, as we know, needs to have an independent clause, right, that has a subject and verb structure, along with anything that depends on it, including phrases and dependent clauses. So if you follow a very strict definition of a T unit, these kinds of sentence fragments, even though they are punctuated as if it's a full sentence, will not really be counted as T units. And therefore, if you subscribe to these notions of AS unit or C unit, you're going to have this mismatch. But L2SC actually counts them as T units, and therefore it kind of nicely aligns with the ways in which these kinds of things will be treated in these other units. Okay. So after looking at all these issues, we developed a pre-processing script in Python, which will do the following. First of all, it will actually convert the sample to lowercase. This will not really affect the analysis of L2SCA, but it allows for easy identification of repetitions. But this may not be a necessary step, right? We don't have to do this, but we found that it made our job a little easier without really affecting our results. So once we have done that, we then removed a number of things, including disfluencies such as and the fillers they use to fill a pause, the false starts like I think, let me. So whatever it is, we get rid of those false starts or repetitions. Any kind of meaningless repetition, like it's very hard if that's like when you are thinking and then you're repeating what you said just now, and also textual noises such as special characters or superfluous punctuation marks. So of course, after pre-processing the transcripts, you are still going to have a lot of grammatical problems in the transcript, right? So if you have curiosity as to how will the tool handle errors, right? You probably want to take a look at the 2010 paper. So keep in mind that because we're looking at these higher level structures, a lot of lower level problems will not affect the counts of these larger units. So if I am counting clauses or dependent clauses, and there is a problem with grammar or with collocation within the clause, it is not going to affect my clause count. However, if I am actually counting a very specific structure and there is a problem with that structure, then you will more likely end up with a problem, right? But at the end of the day, there will be some errors of the tool, just like there may be errors with a human analyzer. The key thing here is that how serious or how severe those problems are, right? And then, as we mentioned just now, we also did the repunctuation, okay? And we really only found 2 discrepancies, so we decided to let it go. We didn't really make any changes to the pre-processing script as the result of this analysis. And here are the 2 examples. One is like, I think if people has right for their health, period, smokers in public are ignoring our rights, so I don't agree to smoking in public. And that's in the original file. And when we were listening to that, we thought, well, it should be something like, I think if people has right for their health, comma, smokers in public are ignoring our rights, so I don't agree to smoking in public. Well, of course, it's hard to say which one is correct, but this illustrates a potential discrepancy when subjective judgment is at play, right, in punctuating speech samples for sentence boundaries. And the next one, so I disagree to have the non-smoke in the public place for the distress. I think currently some country. So we thought, I disagree to have the non-smoke in the public place for the distress, because some people argue that people want to smoke in public place because they need to distress, right? So, there were some part of speech problems here and there, but we thought in terms of meaning, it makes more sense to us to say in the public space for the distress, and then I think currently some country. So there were these kinds of issues, but because of the very small number of discrepancies, we just let it go. And here we have the correlations between human computed and tool computed indices, and they were all very strong and significant. So then we went ahead and then pre-processed all the other samples and then used L2SCA to calculate the 6 indices for each one of them. Now, the second part, which is the main part of the study, is to look at the effects of proficiency, L1 background, and topic on SC in L2 speaking, right? And as we said just now, we built 6 models for each of the, will be 2 models for each of the 6 variables. So the first set of models will build with a proficiency operationalized as CFR level, right? Basically we constructed a separate linear mixed effects model for each measure with the index as the dependent variable, CFR, L1 background, and topic as fixed factors, and the participant ID as a random intercept. And we found that MOT, VPT, and the CPT models, their residuals really violated approximate normality assumptions. So we discarded those guys and only look at the results for the other 3 features. So it'll be relatively quick, right? This model is for MLC, mean length of clause. And you can really just skip to the p-values here. You can see that there is individual variation, right? Pretty important. But for us, we actually did not see a proficiency effect here for MLC. we did see an effect for L1 background, and we also see an effect for topic. And if you look at these graphs here, you can see that, okay, looks like the part-time job topic elicited longer clauses than the smoking topic, right? In terms of L1, Chinese speakers produced the longest clauses among the three groups, right? Actually longer than both Japanese and Korean learners. So, and we didn't really see a level effect. You can see here, there was some increase, but the increase is not significant. And then for the next model for dependent clauses, right, finite subordination, we see an effect for proficiency, right? And in other words, we see that B2 level learners actually produced more dependent clauses than A2 level learners, right? We also see an effect for L1, right? L1 Japanese learners actually produced significantly significantly less dependent clauses than Chinese speakers. And then also topic as well, right? So in other words, this time the smoking topic elicited more dependent clauses than the part-time job topic. And then the last model is for complex nominals. Here we actually see a significant effect of proficiency, not for L1 background, but then also for topic. Okay, so right away we can see that depending on the measure we are looking at, we do see different kinds of effects. So we cannot really assume that these variables will just have the same kind of effect on whatever measure you're looking at, which makes it important to look at complexity as a multidimensional construct, right? So as a summary, we can see that models 2 and 3 both show the main effects of proficiency. Models 1 and 2 both show the main effects of L1 background, and all three models show the main effects of topic, which means that topic really elicits different degrees of complexity across all three measures. Okay, and then next we have, I'm going to get a little quicker because of time, but also now that we have seen this set of results, it becomes easy to explain all of the rest results. So here we have really the same kind of stuff, except that we are operationalizing proficiency as TOEIC scores, right? So it is really important to think of these kinds of methodological issues because depending on the specific measure or operationalization of a construct, sometimes you do end up with different results because there's different ways of measuring something sometimes capture something in different ways, right? And they may have implications for your findings. So here again, we discarded three models because they were not really very strongly or meaningfully correlated with TOEIC scores to begin with, and therefore not interesting to look at because you're just not going to find any interesting results, right? And then also another model didn't meet the normal distribution requirement for the residuals. So here again, very similar, except the difference in operationalizing proficiency. We actually see this time we actually see a proficiency effect on mean length of clause, right? Which we did not see just now when we were using CFR and CEFR levels. And then we also, so basically for this particular model, we see main effects for all the three variables. We see proficiency, right? The higher level speakers produce longer clauses. We see this increase going up. And then for L1 and topic, the effects really stay the same as in the previous models. So the key thing here is, of course, looking at proficiency because we are operationalizing proficiency differently here. And the other two variables, you can expect them to stay more or less the same in this case. For this model, for dependent clauses or finite subordination, we also see significant effects for all three variables. And then finally, for topic, right? Sovereign for complex nominals, we again see a proficiency effect. We do not see a first language background effect, but we again also see a topic effect. Okay, so to summarize, we can see that all three models show the main effects of TOEIC score, with participants with higher TOEIC scores producing longer clauses as well as more dependent clauses, and the complex nominals per clause. We also see 2 models showing main effects of first language background, but not all of them. And all 3 models show the main effects of topic. Okay, so all these results, of course, right now might not make a lot of sense to you, but I think they will become more meaningful and interpretable once we compare them against previous results. So the last analysis we did was to add the L1 speaker data. The corpus also contains data produced by L1 English speakers. And we thought, because we didn't have advanced learners in our data set, right? We only had a A2, B1, and B2, so relatively narrow proficiency band. We thought maybe the L1 speaker data could offer some insight as to further, if you move further down the proficiency scale, what's going to happen. But of course, it's kind of dangerous to think of L1 speakers as necessarily at a higher proficiency level. We don't want to claim that. But on the other hand, it is possible, right? And the problem is that we don't really have proficiency information about the L1 speakers, right? We only have the L1 speaker status. So we decided to look at L1 speaker in 2 ways. One actually is to treat it as if it is a proficiency level, right, higher than B2. Which I think on average probably may be the case. So we think of L1, we just treated L1 status as a different CEFR level, right? And when we do it this way, we actually see many facts of proficiency for all 3 measures. And actually you can see that for mean length of clause and dependent clauses, native speakers are higher than the other 3 groups. However, from complex nominals, native speakers are kind of comparable to B2 speakers, but both of them are higher than A2 and B1. But we see some differences. And then the other way is to not treat L1 status as a high proficiency level, but to treat it as if it's just another L1 background, right? So we have L1 Chinese, L1 Japanese, L1 Korean. Now we have L1 English. Okay, so this becomes a level in the L1 background variable. And again, when we do that, we again see main effects of L1 background for all 3 models, right? And this is interesting because just now, if you remember in the summaries, right, we it's not the case that L1 background had a significant effect in all models, but once we add the L1 English speakers, we do see a major effect in all models. Okay, so now to summarize, what does all of this mean for us, right? So I will talk about the implications of these 2 sets of results. First of all, pertaining to tool reliability. It is really good practice to assess the reliability of automated linguistic analysis tools on the researcher's data set at hand, both for tools whose developers have not reported reliability and for tools whose developers have reported reliability on data sets that may differ from the data set at hand in substantial ways. So in other words, if you're using a tool to analyze your data and you have no idea how the tool does because the developer or researchers have never reported any information on how well it does, then you want to be careful, right? You really want to do some kind of a evaluation of how it will perform on your data, typically by manually coding a subset, right? And then evaluate how it does. That way you will have a confidence in how well it might perform on your entire data set. It is kind of risky to not do that and just let it run on everything. And sometimes, and it should be the case most of the time actually, so you will actually see reports of how well the tool performs. However, sometimes the researcher may have evaluated the performance of the tool on a data set that's very different from what you're doing. So like in my case, L2ICA was evaluated on L2 writing data. We have no idea how well it will perform on L2 speaking data, right? So we wanted to do this evaluation as well. So this is an early attempt to evaluate and improve the reliability of automated syntactic complexity analysis tools on L2 speech data. And therefore, we do not claim that we have looked at everything, that we have solved the problem. But we can say that tentatively L2SCA can achieve an acceptable level of reliability on the pre-processed L2 speech samples. as demonstrated in the significant strong correlations with human computed indices. However, these findings cannot be taken as evidence that L2SCA will perform with comparable levels of reliability on all types of L2 speaking data, right? Depending on the proficiency level, like what do you do when you have even lower proficiency speakers? And also what do you do when they have no prep time, when they are having a conversation? We cannot generalize to those kinds of data sets just yet. And also we cannot claim that the tool will work well for other indices. We want to look at 6 indices specifically. Now, about the results of the effects of the 3 variables, let's look at proficiency first. So our results revealed significant cross-proficiency differences for MLC, DCC, and the CNC, with the latter 2 increasing significantly with CFR levels, and all 3 increasing significantly with TOEIC scores. That's just a summary, right? We do see proficiency having an effect, and they tend to increase with proficiency. So we have seen similar results for MLC and the CNC, so in writing. So L2 writing research also reported that as you become more proficient, you do tend to produce longer clauses, and you also tend to produce more complex nominals. So here, that's why we say, well, for these 2 measures, the results converge. So there may be a similar co-growing relationship between proficiency and 2 aspects of SC, namely MLC and the CNC in L2 speaking and writing. Right, so we don't expect substantial differences in how MLC and CNC will develop in speaking and writing. However, different from L2 writing, the growth in finite subordination may span over a much larger proficiency band in L2 speaking than reported in L2 writing speech, L2 writing research. If you follow L2 writing research, you know that subordination has been argued to be indicative of intermediate level of writing proficiency. Meaning as you become more advanced, you actually do not use subordination as much. You start to use a lot of phrases. So you will see this trade-off between subordination and the phrasal complexity. However, we do not see that in our speaking data. And we have confidence because we also throw in L1 speaking data, right? Representing either a higher level of proficiency, which we could argue is valid. And even when we if you look at the L1 speakers, you will see that actually L1 speakers here, they use subordination the most. We don't see any kind of trade-off. We don't see kind of a downtrend, right, as you become more proficient. In other words, this seems to show that subordination does not grow in the same way in speaking as in writing. That's why we say it may actually grow across a larger proficiency band in speaking than in writing, right? We don't see a trade-off between finite subordination and phrasal complexity observed, and also L1 speakers use the finite subordination the most. So in terms of L1 background effects, right, we when we compare our results against the results reported in I 2015, we made 4 observations. Interesting. One is for beginning and intermediate L1 Japanese EFL learners. Syntactic complexity tends to be low in both spoken and written production in comparison to L1 English speakers and learners from other L1 backgrounds. It's very interesting that in both our analysis of L2 writing and our analysis here of L2 speaking, L1 Japanese learners were at the bottom in terms of syntactic complexity. We don't really know why. We're not trying to explain that, but we observe that consistently across multiple measures in both speaking and in writing, right? If you go back to any of these results, you will see that Japanese learners tend to be at the bottom here and here and here. Even the proficiency-wise, they were supposed to be the same as the Chinese and Korean learners you were looking at. And then also we found that L1 background may interact with the production mode in affecting the syntactic complexity of L2 production, which means that L1 background does not affect syntactic complexity in the same ways across writing and speaking. And number 3, the syntactic similarity between Japanese and Korean. So we actually see quite a bit of a similarity between Japanese or Korean learners here and here. They don't differ significantly from each other. So, but there were more differences between Chinese learners and those 2 groups of learners, right? There was some difference there, but really not as much as with Chinese learners. And we suspect that because they were both SOV languages, that might have contributed to the comparable levels of complexity between L1 Japanese and L2 Korean learners. And finally, L1 background does not appear to affect the use of complex nominals as much as it affects other aspects of syntactic complexity in L2 production. We think maybe because of two reasons. One is because in any language, right, Chinese, Japanese, English, you are going to have noun-phrase modification. Even the modification may take different forms and shapes. Modification is important in all languages, right? Even the word order can differ. Different types of modifications may exist, but modification is an important concept. In our way of assessing noun-phrase complexity holistically, we are looking at just a modification. We're not really talking about specific subtypes of modification. So there may be differences in specific subtypes of modification, but that will be another issue. And the other way is, of course, complex noun-phrase usage becomes very important. As you become more advanced, that's how you show your ability to engage with complexity as your proficiency improves. So finally, topic effects, right? We found that the part-time job topic elicited significantly longer clauses and more complex nominals per clause, but significantly fewer dependent clauses per clause than the smoking topic. Right, so interesting, right? One topic wants more subordination, the other topic wants longer clauses and more complex nominals, and therefore more elaboration. Kind of similar to what we found in the Yang et al. Study 2015. So Yoon reported similar results on L2 writing data for MOC and CNC, but he also reported significantly higher finite subordination measured using clause per unit for the part-time job topic. So in other words, in his findings, part-time job topic was just more complex all around. So in light of the partial discrepancy between our and Yoon's results and the previous claims regarding the more prominent role of finite subordination in speaking than in writing, we posit an interaction between topic and production mode, which means that the effect of topic may actually differ in different production modes, speaking versus writing. So in speaking, it's going to work differently than in writing. I'm going to skip the last bit because we don't have time anymore. So implications, right? One is methodological. We have implications for automated syntactic complexity analysis of L2 English speech samples. It is possible, but we need to prepare our data carefully, and also we need to do evaluation as necessary. Our results may inform future studies about L2 English speaking proficiency or automated speech scoring. And then also we need to control the effects of L1 background and topic in L2 speaking syntactic complexity research and L2 speaking test development. A final slide. Here are a few limitations and the future research directions. We can expand the scope of the study by including advanced learners. So we don't have we don't have a C1, C2 learners. We had L1 speakers, but in a way it kind of provides some information, but it's still different from advanced learners. Also learners with more diverse L1 backgrounds, as well as speech samples produced on more diverse topics, right? The speech features of other types of spoken production can be examined, such as dialogues, for example, to enhance the pre-processing process and further improve the accuracy of the analysis. We limited our analysis to holistic measures only. We do need to look at these other features, right? More fine-grained ones, assuming they do, the features are actually being used in your data set, of course. So I think it's always necessary to do a pilot analysis to show whether the fine-grained features you decide to look at will actually at least be used adequately frequently in your data set for them to be meaningful. And then also finally, direct comparisons of spoken and written production would allow a better understanding of the potential effects of the interaction between different learner or task-related variables and production mode on L2 syntactic complexity. We were just trying to compare our results from speaking to previous results on writing. And obviously, if we kind of combine the analysis of both in the same study, we can directly compare them and talk about differences and similarities more effectively. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say, and I will stop here.
Okay, maybe Dr. Yang's net doesn't work well. So I will say something about Dr. Liu's lecture. So thank you very much for Dr. Liu's wonderful lecture. I think, as we can say, right, Dr. Liu has helped us to review previous literature of syntactic complexity from the perspectives of proficiency, background, task-related variables, effects of writing topic, and then focus on the topic, right, about complexity in L2 learners' spoken production. To me, I think it's quite different from the literature I have read before about spoken production, because Dr. Liu focused on the reliability of computer tools for analyzing essay in spoken production. So that is the first question. And then the second one is the effects of proficiency, L1 background topic on L2 speaking, spoken production, especially the proficiency focus on A2, B1, B2. And then for background, that is Chinese, Asian, and Korea. And the topic, two topics, PTG and smoking. So it's quite, I think it's quite enlightening for me to do more on spoken, maybe as well as writing production, right, in the future. I found one interesting point when Dr. Liu reviewed Chen 2015 and Wang 2020 and Biber 2016 spoken production. The results mentioned MLT, DCT, or CPT are higher in spoken production of their subjects. But to me, right, you know, in my dissertation now, I got the Chinese EFL learners, their writing production, actually they do more, or in you know, the subordination, the clause, right? Even for human readers, when they give ratings, you know, for the learners, they focus on MLT or DCT or CPT. So what kind of implications I can give to Chinese learners or Chinese teachers for these kind of results? So Dr. Liu, can you give me some,
right.
something
Yes.
I can, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so actually, as I was discussing the potential discrepancy even among the results of the few studies that we talked about, you know, you have to be careful to not directly translate their results into your context of research, because you may be looking at different kinds of learners. So already we show that proficiency level and topic and their L1 background could all affect syntactic complexity. Right. This means if they are looking at, and we did not look at the age of the learners, for example, and also the learning experience, you know, are they speaking a lot at home every day, or are they just really speaking English only in the classroom? That's going to have a big difference as well. So you have to look at, if you want to compare your results against theirs, you have to look at what kinds of variables are shared. Right? Are they producing things for similar kinds of purposes on similar kinds of topics? Are the learners of the, so if you look at L1 Chinese and L1 Japanese, L1 Korean learners, even though they may be at the same proficiency level, they can still do very different kinds of things. So it's not really surprising that you may actually see different results in your study than those reported in other studies. And this really showcased the importance of examining specific learner groups, right? You know, just like CDST theory argues, no two learners will be the same. And that's not surprising. And it is important to see, if you want to understand your learner and how they are developing and how they are performing, you want to provide help to them, you need to examine how they are doing. Right. Of course, if you do a group level analysis, that's kind of different. So group trends will always, maybe there will be more similarities in terms of group trends, right, at a larger scale across different learner groups. But at the individual level, you will see a big difference. I think that actually supports the findings I'm reporting here, that all these variables, of course, we are really focusing on the main effects of individual variables. We're not even talking about interactions among them. You will see that it is a very complicated picture, right? I think so. if you are reporting results that are different, number one, describe what the differences are. Okay, so I found this, they found this. And number two, try to look deeper into the design of the two studies and say the two studies differ in their design in these ways, right? Which variables do you differ? Sometimes even sample size, but I think there will be a lot of variables that will be different. And if you, maybe there was some similarities too, and citing previous research, or maybe sometimes you can do a bit of further analysis. You can show that the difference may have arisen from differences in these variables of the learners or the tasks, right? And the implications of this really is to show that the ways in which these variables may affect complexity could vary, right, by different learner groups, by again could vary along the dimensions of different kinds of features of your learners or contexts, right? That shows just because somebody had studied this in one context, then research is done on this topic. No, right? It shows that we do need to examine different kinds of context and different kinds of combinations of learner and task variables more carefully. Okay.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And we can see there are two questions in the chat.
In the chat. Okay, so I'll briefly comment on those. The first question is really, really good. So the question is basically asking, some students who are throwing very complex structures, right? Long sentences, a lot of dependent clauses, but they are not always grammatical, and also they may not always be good or appropriate or effective. Yet at the same time, are they going to get a higher score because they are using more complex structures? Okay, so I do want to say that, again, this particular study falls on the quantitative side of the analysis. And there were obvious limitations of this line of research. But what we are trying to do is the extent to which the use of complex structures may be correlated with or may be predictive of human ratings of quality, right? And we can expect to see some relationships, but we also know that the relationship is not really linear. In other words, you really can only contribute so much by trying to use complex structures. And once you reach a certain level, further contribution of grammatical complexity on the overall quality will become smaller, number one. And number two, this is also the precise reason I'm arguing for a functional turn in SC research, right? So if you follow my more recent research, I'm still pursuing quantitative research, trying to figure out how can we improve our understanding of the quantitative relations between these kinds of measures and how to speak on writing quality. I still do that, but I think I also now pay more attention to the functions of these kinds of complexity features. In other words, why are learners using them for? Are they using them for the right purposes, right? Is their use of this kind of structures effective for what they're trying to do, right? So if you're writing letters, for example, are you using the right kinds of structures for the right kinds of speech acts? If you're writing research articles, are you using the right kinds of structures for the right kinds of rhetoric functions? So that is the next level of analysis that we have to do, right? In a way, yes, if you improve complexity to some level, you can hope to see some increase in the overall rating, but it will not keep going up linearly because there were a lot of other factors affecting both human judgment, especially human judgment of quality, and therefore that judgment will be reflected in the quantitative relationship we identify between these features and the human ratings. Okay, but we do need to look at both in pedagogy and in human assessment and in research. We need to look at the functions of these kinds of structures and are they being used appropriately in general appropriate ways and effectively. And there was a study, there was a question on whether we can treat speaking and writing as two different subsystems interacting with each other. I think yes. If you think about the Chan paper, right, that was done with Verspoor, who is a very important figure in CDST. And to them, you can examine the interaction of different kinds of subsystems of language within one mode of production, such as speaking only. But we know that speaking and writing, they are both developing,